Hello, students. This is our unit number 3 review video. I'm going to talk through our study guide for us to talk about our review. Before we get into our study guide, what I would like for us to do is to go over these two standards that we have for our study guide. So here we go. Alrighty. So our first standard is here, 6.14. You don't really need to worry about the number. Growth and change. Explain the social, political, economic, and cultural shifts taking place in the United States at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. So this has kind of been our big thing here, our shifts. And you'll see that with our questions in our study guide, a lot of them have to do with shifts. So changes. So we're looking at changes going on in America that are about America's society. How does America's society change? How do politics change? How does America's economy change? How does America's culture change? And that's what we're going to be looking at in our study guide and what we have looked at throughout our unit number 3. Our other standard says evaluate the historical impact of the progressive era with regard to governmental and industrial reforms. So the word reform, what that means, it's kind of like reforming something, right? So you kind of break it apart and you put it back together, right? And so the progressives are going to be reforming America. They're going to be changing some things in America. And in their name, the progressives, what they want is progress in America. And so we'll be looking at that today as well. So our number 1, folks, it says describe the social and economic shifts. Now, see that shift? Well, I was telling you that occurred from the developing systems of transportation. So this is what we saw. We saw that America gained trains, the technology of trains, and the technology of steamboats. And what this did was it really did change America socially. What things changed was that the average person can travel and go on vacations now. Before, really only rich people could go on vacations because you would have to walk or take a horse to have you go to your destination for your vacation. And that may take you a month or 2 or 3 months for you to have your vacation. Now, obviously, very few people can afford to take off work that long. That's a long time to take off work, right? Like 2, 3 months, maybe even more. So that was really only something that was left to the rich. However, now with transportation speeding up with trains and steamboats, the average person can now take a vacation. And people can now move if they want to. They can move to new cities and states. They could travel across the country. They could pick up their bags. They could pack up their house and pack up all their main belongings, put them on a train, and go from, let's say, Washington, D.C., all the way out to California. You could do that if you wanted. Before, you couldn't do that. And with the train and with the steamboat, businesses can trade more. They can trade more often and farther than they could before. And just in general, America's economy increases. It increased America's economy because businesses could do more business now. Our second one says describe the political and economic shifts that occurred from governmental policies. So the government created an antitrust law, trust meaning monopoly, laws that should break up monopolies. But we saw that the government mostly ignored monopolies or mostly allowed monopolies to still exist. So the government mostly allowed monopolies to still exist. So in terms of economics, not too much of an economic shift when it comes to governmental policies. However, with political shifts, we see as well, or I should say, in addition, government ignores enforcing some laws. Okay, so we see a shift really where the government doesn't really do much, at least yet. Now, as I said before, the progressives are going to kind of change that, but the government is lazy. It's laissez-faire. Okay, the government is hands off of the economy, and so it's lazy to help. It's lazy to do anything. And we'll see here for shifts in the South just how much the government does not do much. So, socially, in the South, after the Civil War, the government kept Union soldiers in the South in order to protect the newly freed slaves. But after the Union Army left, the Union Army eventually leaves because some presidents don't want the Union Army there protecting these newly freed slaves. They don't care so much about their well-being, about the newly freed slaves' well-being. So they take out the Union Army, and this allowed for Jim Crow laws to be slowly added over time. Now, there was no slavery in the South, right? Slavery was gone, but people are going to try to get the South as close to it as possible without them actually having slavery. So notice what they do. What they do is that whites in the South still wanted African Americans to do poorly. So African Americans were discriminated and hated, and they had their rights taken from them, especially, they were treated with hate, with prejudice, discrimination daily, and disrespect daily. So socially as an African American, there would be a shift. You would notice a shift after the Union Army left, that there was a change in how people treated you. After the Union Army leaves the South, the Southerners begin to treat the African Americans worse. And politically, after the Union Army left the South, African Americans slowly lost the ability to vote. They were voted out of office, and they were segregated. They were limited to poor housing and lousy jobs. So politically, their rights are taken from them. And this kind of culminates in this famous court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And it says that people can be separate but equal. And what this did was that it made Jim Crow laws legal at the federal level. What that means is that basically the government is giving people permission to discriminate against African Americans all they want, more or less. So the social shifts that Plessy versus Ferguson caused was that people could now be more obvious with their racism. Racism could now be more obvious in your face and on a sign. White people can be openly racist since they know it's legal to discriminate now, with this Plessy versus Ferguson case giving them permission. So we see a shift, right? Now, this is going to cause a reaction from African Americans. African Americans react to this inequality. And what they do is that they end up moving. So during World War I, people began to go off to Europe. Mostly white men go off to Europe to fight. And many factory jobs were available. Because these men are gone to war, they now need people to fill their positions in these factories. Well, there were few opportunities in the South, and most of the factories were up north. And so African Americans began to move up north to cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York. Now, this was a large internal migration. This is a migration inside of America from southern states to northern states. Okay, so it's African Americans, 1.5 million African Americans moving up north. And they had to overcome threats and violence from Southerners on their move. In fact, Southerners didn't want African Americans to leave. Even though African Americans were hated by the Southerners wanted to keep hating them. And they did not want the African Americans to leave because they wanted to keep hating them. Isn't that weird? So African Americans tried to gain more of their rights, of their natural rights up north. They tried to gain more liberty. They tried to gain more freedom, and they tried to gain property because down south they were limited to poor housing. So they want to get better houses up north. Now, what ends up happening about the treatment of African Americans in these northern states is that white Americans did not like their neighborhoods and towns changing. With all these African Americans moving up north, their streets are going to look a little different now, because now it's not going to be all white people walking down the street. Now it's going to be a little bit of a mix of people walking down the street. And now it's not going to be all white men in these factories. It's going to be a mix of people in these factories. And so there's going to be a tension for competition of jobs. And so, for the first few years of the Great Migration, there were many race riots. Northerners were thought to be more kind to African Americans, but white Americans reacted with hate against African Americans up north. Race riots were especially bad in 1919. There were over 25 race riots in America, and many people died. They were killing African Americans for moving up north. It's crazy. And so African Americans had to continue their struggle even in northern states. But again, people thought northern states would be better. They weren't really. They were kind of, sort of, but for the most part, no. All right, describe the political and social shifts that the government made towards Native Americans, including the policies the government created. So for the first half of America's history, America kept pushing Native Americans out of lands. And they would buy land from Native Americans. Now, America gets kind of frustrated with this process where they keep on having to kick Native Americans out of this land. They don't want to have to kick Native Americans over and over out of land. And so for the second half of America's history, they changed. America tried to change Native Americans to being civilized. So children were forcefully taken to boarding schools. And in these schools, these Native American children were forbidden to teach their language, culture, or beliefs. They were not allowed to talk in their own language. They were not allowed to talk in their own culture or about their own culture or about their own beliefs. That was forbidden. Native Americans, they were trying to erase Native Americans' identity. So Native Americans, what made things sometimes difficult with these land agreements is that Native Americans did not believe land could be owned. This made agreements for selling land confusing for Native Americans. And sometimes Native Americans thought that they were, in fact, renting out land, but in fact, they lost it forever. The government created the Dawes Act. This created land, Native American land, to be sold. And the president could sell the Native American land whenever he wanted. And so it sold 2/3 of all Native Americans' land once the government began to sell it. They lost 2/3. That's so much. So Native Americans moved to the poorest quality land like deserts and rocky soil. So Native Americans are going to react to this, right? They're not going to be happy about this, obviously. So there were some Indian wars. There were some battles. Native Americans did fight back. However, most Native Americans just gave in and would go to these reservations without a fight. And there were increased rates of poverty, depression, alcoholism, and suicides. Tribes tried to maintain some of their identity during this time. They tried their best. And most tribes were able to keep some pieces of themselves, but some tribes' identity disappeared altogether. They were erased from history during this time. This brings us to the progressive movement. They wanted to have progress, as I said earlier, and they wanted to change lots of stuff. They wanted to change things like how much America was drinking alcohol, women's voting rights. They wanted to fix poverty, immigration, education, civil rights, taxation, election process, working conditions, child labor, government corruption. They wanted to fix all of that stuff. And they started to make an impact. So one of America's core ideals is limited government. This is the belief that America should have a weak government so that it can't become too powerful and be tyrannical to the people. And so American people tend to resist the government gaining more power. We tend to not like government gaining power because we're afraid of a president becoming a king someday. But the progressives call for the government to gain more powers, okay? So people are going to be a little uncomfortable with what the progressives suggest, because the progressives are suggesting the government gets more involved. There's going to be a lot of pushback to this because, again, Americans are paranoid of the government gaining power. But regardless, they wanted the government to get more involved in the economy. They wanted America's democracy to be improved as well with democratic elections. And so one man, Teddy Roosevelt, became the face of the progressives. He became known as the trust buster, trust meaning monopoly. And he ends up breaking up 40 monopolies, which is a lot. And he believed in control of corporations, protections of consumers, and conserving natural resources. Now, the reason why that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to control monopolies, the reason why that he wanted to protect consumers is because of this stuff. So, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, he wrote a book called The Jungle, and this exposed the meat packing industry's poor quality. They were making sausages with rat meat in it. It was disgusting, and America was shocked at what they had been eating. So government responded by making the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, and that's what protects us today. That's what makes it to where companies have to list the ingredients on products, because before they did not have to do that, but now they do. Another person named Ida Tarbell, she exposed how the monopolies were doing illegal business practices. And this led up to the breakup of the Standard Oil monopoly. Government finally begins to break up monopolies, and she's the one that actually inspires Teddy to begin breaking up monopolies. So basically what I'm saying is Ida Tarbell started first, and then Teddy agrees with her and then starts breaking up these monopolies. That's what I'm saying. But there were other progressivists that were exposing things. Muckrakers, these are journalists that are raking muck or digging up dirt. Okay, you probably heard of that saying before, dig up dirt on someone, right? So they're trying to expose things that are going wrong in America. And what they do is that they expose how widespread child labor was. They expose how unsafe workplaces were. And they proved it was often the boss's fault, not the workers' fault for these accidents. And the government created laws for safety now. So woohoo, they're protecting the people. And they also began to slowly side with these workers and not the boss. They began to try to protect the workers now. And the progressives made other changes. They made direct changes to America's government, being that in the 16th Amendment, the progressives helped pass the 16th Amendment. And the 16th Amendment allowed the federal government to tax income. Now, the government gets most of its taxes from income now, not alcohol. Because before income tax, government was getting most of its money from alcohol sales. But the government does not need alcohol anymore to receive money. And so prohibition will be possible. We're going to see prohibition in just a second. The 17th Amendment was also passed by the progressives, and they wanted the senators to be elected directly by the people. The reason why that they did this was because the Senate was often understood to sometimes be corrupt. It would stop legislatures from making corrupt deals with senators. It prevents corruption in government. And the government was quite corrupt back then. And so the progressives are trying to make progress. And so they help America's government not be so corrupt. And in the 18th Amendment, this is where they ban alcohol. Now, this is America's government trying to help to fix people's problems. They're trying to fix people's problems, namely alcoholism, because alcoholism was so bad. People drank 3 times more than what they do today back then, just to show you how bad it was. And many people were going homeless because they were spending all their money on alcohol. Many men would be coming home from work drunk and beating their wives. And so the government hoped that preventing people from drinking would prevent homelessness, it would prevent domestic abuse, and it would prevent accidents at work, because sometimes people be working and be drunk, which is very dangerous. And then we get the 19th Amendment. The progressives pass the 19th Amendment, and this helps women gain the right to vote. And this is super cool because now the government is more equal. We're more of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that politicians had to start to listen to women if they wanted to get elected. Okay, so they'd have to do what women wanted because women literally make up 50% of America's population, which means that politicians are going to have to listen to women if they want women to vote for them. And so, really cool. Lots of changes in America happening in this unit, folks. So, make sure that you check out our review game. We're going to have a review game, and let me know if you need any help. Make sure that you complete all of the assignments in our Unit 3 study guide. And